we'll just go ahead and start now because I think it's right at the hour. I don't want anybody to turn into a pumpkin or lose a glass slipper. So I wanted you to know how much I appreciate all of the feedback that I've been getting, especially through email, and the opportunities for clarification, as well as just interaction and promises of prayer and all kinds of stuff. My wife and family are indeed grieving the loss of my father-in-law, her dad, and we already feel that hole pretty acutely. But we're thankful that, and I know this sounds trite, but we're thankful that that his journey is over, and that the suffering and the loneliness and those kinds of things, because he was in a home and nursing hours and visiting times and protocol and all was such that it was difficult to get many visitors in to see him. Anyway, that's all finished, and we're grateful for this next chapter in his life. Anyway, thank you for your prayers for me and for my wife and for all of our family. I genuinely appreciate that. Now, there was a statement that I made, or part of a discussion last time, that if you will permit me, I'd like to clarify just a little bit. I did get a question about my reference to John chapter 8, verse 41, about the religious leaders saying to Jesus, "We're not illegitimate," and the insinuation is that Jesus is. Okay, the reason that I made reference to John chapter 8 was not to try to validate or to corroborate the truthfulness of what people like the early rabbis in the Tosefta and elsewhere, or that the early Greek philosopher Celsus said about Jesus' illegitimacy. I was not trying to suggest that Jesus was illegitimate. What I was trying to do was firmly root that attitude toward, or that approach to dealing with Jesus, in a first century text, which we were able to do by reference to John. So what those later texts are referring to is actually much earlier than they are, than Celsus is in the early 100s, or that the early rabbis are, the Tanaim in the Tosefta and Jerusalem Talmud, Babylonian Talmud, and the like. So we do have this, and that's always the goal of the historical Jesus researcher, writer, teacher, is to be able to ground and root a practice, a custom, a Bible interpretation, the use of a word, the meaning of a word, or whatever, in a first century text. Many times you get complaints from people at one side of the spectrum or the other theologically that, well, you can't really refer to this set of ancient texts because they don't go back to the first century. And sometimes it's difficult to know that. So when you can ground and root something in a first century text, then you have moved the ball in the direction of establishing that these are first century realities, and they can be factored into our understanding of an appreciation of the person of Jesus. So I fully subscribe to virgin birth. I fully subscribe to the full deity of Jesus as taught in texts like Colossians 2:9, John chapter 1, book of Hebrews chapter 1, etc. So it wasn't a matter of trying to validate the claim of these extra biblical texts as much as it was to indicate the antiquity, the ancientness of that argument against Jesus in general. So we've got it in the first century. Hopefully we're all good to go with that. I'd like to give you another example of this very thing. Ever since Jacob Neusner began to argue in the 1980s, 1990s, that you could not, you shouldn't use as E.P. Sanders and others had been using rabbinic literature to better understand Jesus. Jacob Neusner said, no, you can't do that because all that stuff is too late. Well, then Christian scholars picked up on that complaint and have been using this. You can't appeal to rabbinic literature, the stuff from the early rabbis, because we can't date it and it's not reliable and all this other stuff. So I developed a methodology of doing exactly what I just illustrated to you by reference to John 8:41, is when you can find a text that is datable, whether by orthography or by carbon 14 or by the contents of the text. Like, for example, if you can date some later interpretation or application or rabbinic rule or whatever, if you can demonstrate that shows up in a text that is datable to the first century, like a New Testament text or Josephus, first century Jewish historian or whatever, then you have established the antiquity of that reality. I call it, my reference, my way of referring to that methodology is time stamping. Now, I don't know that anyone has come up with another term, so I'm just going to keep on using that till some other term becomes popular. So you timestamp your data by means of archaeology or some text that is very clearly New Testament and the period, first century, and then you can take that and apply that to New Testament realities. I'm not sure if any of that matters to a lot of people, but to those that it does matter to, does that make sense? When you get into, after the course or even during it, you get into stuff, you get into secondary literature, stuff written by modern scholars, you will begin to hear those kinds of arguments and that kind of issue being debated within that literature. So even if for no other reason we're laying up in store some information that you need to know to decode what you're reading later on, well, that's still a good discussion to have had. I also wanted to mention to you tonight, we're not going to do a full-blown like Q&A at the very beginning, but I don't want to cut off all interaction. So what I have done is I have muted everybody, but with permission to dial in and make a comment or ask a question by depressing the space bar for as long as you speak, and then letting it go when you're finished speaking. And we'll just keep doing that because it seemed to work at least to some degree of success last week. All right, what I would like to do now is share screen, and I would like to go back to the presentation, the PowerPoint that I was using when we ran out of time last week. So are you seeing it on your screen? Somebody nod yes or shake your head no. Yeah, okay. And so then I've got to get rid of some controls so that I can actually see what I'm doing. Let's see. Okay, I'll go full screen also, or try to. All right. Okay, so we were talking about, and we're going to do maybe a half an hour this session on finishing up what we were doing last time on the education of Jesus. And then toward the end of the same PowerPoint, I'm going to start throwing in things about Jesus' personal piety and the personal piety of some people, folks in and around Galilee in the first century BC, first century AD. So let's talk for a moment about memorization. It's an important component of education in the days of Jesus. And we talked about some of these terms and realities last time, so I'm not going to revisit all of that, but I did get down to, if you'll look at my pointer, Dr. Benzion Wacholder and my doctor father, who had this unbelievable memory, who lived on into the lifetimes of pretty much everybody that's on this Zoom call. So the reality is that we have sold quite short memory in recent times. You have to take jellyfish stuff to improve your memory, and we can't remember anything, so we have Post-it notes all over the place, and all kinds of alarms that we've put on our watch to remind us of things. But the reality of it is that we have people who have lived into our lifetime who had literally World Book encyclopedia size worth of data stored in their brain that was accessible at a moment's notice, in much like a database or a hard drive that we have connected to our computer. Now, let's go on to some texts that discuss this business of memory and this matter of Jewish learning being a matter of traditional learning, of passing on material that has been accepted by generations and handed down by word of mouth in the oral Torah of the rabbis. So we have this passage in Mishnah Eduyot, Tractate Eduyot, chapter 1, paragraph 3. Hillel says, now there's a way that you can stratify rabbinic literature. When you have a specific sage cited in that text, or some event or reality cited in that text, then you can do kind of archaeological stratigraphy in literature. And when Hillel says, that puts you very firmly within the end of the 1st century BC and the beginning of the 1st century AD. Hillel was the co-chair of the Sanhedrin at the birth of Jesus, and he lived until AD 10, which means that Jesus would have been somewhere around middle teens when Hillel died. So Hillel says, and he's the head of one of the two great houses of Pharisaic or rabbinic learning, 1 hin of drawn water renders the mikveh unfit, or the ritual immersion bath unfit. And then the rabbis in the next generation say of this, we speak of hin only because a man must use the manner of speaking of his teacher. In other words, later they'll start using the word log, L-O-G, which is another measurement of liquid measurement, like we would say gallon or quart or pint or something like that. And so what these people are doing in the next generation, the generation after that, and the like, they are memorizing not only the basic components of what has been handed down to them, but they're memorizing and passing on to the next generation the very terminology, even when that terminology has passed out of its prime and is no longer used. It's passed on into disuse, and something else has replaced it. Now let's go on to Mishnah Avot, chapter 3, paragraph 9. He who forgets one word of his study, the scripture reckons it to him as though he were guilty against his own soul. In other words, other texts will say, and is worthy to inherit Gehenna, or worthy to bust hell wide open, as we say down south. The third text that I've got here on this slide is a text from also from Tractate Avot in the Mishnah, chapter 6, paragraph 6. Greater than priesthood or kingship is he who, listen to this, retells exactly what he has heard and reports a thing in the name of him who sent it. There's another place, we'll cover this in a subsequent slide, that says, if you do this, then what you do is you hasten the coming of the Messiah. You bring deliverance to the world. So you're actually engaging in heavenly, important spiritual work that has the potential to usher in new heavens and new earth realities. Again, Mishnah Avot, he who tells a thing in the name of him who said it brings deliverance to the world. There you have it. Now, in the TB is Babylonian Talmud, or Talmud Bavli in Hebrew. Tractate Sanhedrin, and then it has a different numbering system. It numbers by page numbers, and each page has a front side and a back side. So the front side would be 99A. We're looking at page 99B. By the way, I did mention to you this database that is free and available on the internet. You can access it with any device, including your cell phone, called Safaria. You can depress your key because I'm not looking at your faces right now. Safaria.com, Sefaria. Did I mention that to you already?
I have not heard of it, so I don't think that you've mentioned it.
All right, so let me do that then. This is now it's a good time for a commercial. Safaria, Sefaria, Safaria.com. Sefer, it's based on the word Sefer in Hebrew, and Sefer means book or scroll. That will give you free of charge in digital form, fully searchable, all of early rabbinic literature. It gives you other stuff as well, later stuff written by medieval rabbis and that kind of thing. It'll also give you the Hebrew Bible. And the beauty of it is it gives you both English and Hebrew for most of this stuff. Not all of it, but much of it. So that's there for you to use. And what you can do is you can check my references. And if I'm wrong, then you can just throw out everything that I say because I've misled you. But that's one reason why I give you these references is I fully intend for you to fact check this, to not take anything that I say at face value, but rather to do your own research. And once you get into that stuff, you're going to find all kinds of fun things that will get you in trouble in church because you're sitting there reading the Talmud while you're supposed to be listening to the sermon or praying or singing or something like that. All right, here's another one.
By the way, I tried that, and it gives me a forbidden.
Gives you a what?
A forbidden. You don't have permission to access on this server.
I got the same.
It's .org and .com.
When you tried to get, when you tried to use Safaria.com?
Yeah,
it's .org. It's .org, O-R-G.
Oh, .org, okay. All right, so then no one's able to get it? Is that what I'm hearing?
No, it's just safaria.org.
Okay, Safaria.org.
I'm able to get it.
I used mine this week. In fact, I use it every week.
Yes, it works with .org.
All right, so misfire on my part. My apologies for that. Sorry for the frustration. I know I was up really late one night and my wife came in where I was, the light was still on, and she said, "Why aren't you asleep?" And I said, "Honey, I'm reading Bavli Tractate Yevamot, and it's awesome. I can't set it down." So that I got in trouble this week about Safaria. Safaria.org. All right, good. That's the first mistake I've made in the last 5 minutes. Okay, we are at the Bavli Sanhedrin 99b. Rabbi Akiva. Now we have another sage, and Akiva is an early sage. You can say all you want. Well, the Yerushalmi is from the year 400, and the Bavli is from the year 500. Yeah, but this text is telling us that Akiva said this. Akiva was born in the 1st century AD, and he was martyred during the Bar Kokhba revolt in the 130s, the early 130s AD. I think that his martyrdom was in Caesarea too. Anyway, he says, sing, or you could translate this chant. Chant or sing every day. Chant or sing every day. In other words, review your studies like a song that one sings over and over. And the same text refers to constant review and study. So we're still working on memory. seems like that we had another text. Maybe it shows up somewhere else that says, he who repeats his learning 101 times is greater than he who repeats his learning 100 times. We'll run across that at some point. All right. All right. I wanted to talk briefly about education in Judaism and how this is reflected in Jesus and to a much more minor degree, Paul. And this includes not just formal education, but education in the home, education that takes place involving parents. So you have festivals and ceremonies. All of that is to hand down faith to kids. That's a part of its purpose, because we see this in the Hebrew Bible itself. When your children say, "What does this mean?" then you shall say, in other words, it opens up a window of opportunity for instruction. It's a Passover sacrifice to Yahweh, who passed over the houses of the sons of Israel in Egypt when he smote the Egyptians, etc. Then there are other passages down here at the bottom that basically say the same thing. You even get it on into the book of Joshua when the stones are assembled at Gilgal, and it says, when your children ask you, what does this mean? Then you'll say, it was with a mighty hand and outstretched arm that the Lord, brought us across the Jordan dry shod, etc. Let's take a look at some stuff from Josephus here first century Jew, contemporary of the apostles, and Philo of Alexandria, also first century Jew, contemporary of Jesus and the apostles. And I'm not sure what happened there. They both say, the references are there, that Jewish children were taught Torah and the traditions of the fathers, meaning the oral Torah, from early childhood. And we're going to look and see just how early that is in a subsequent slide. Father and mother are regarded as the child's natural and primary instructors, at least early on. You have some passages in Proverbs, but notice also you have Ben Sira, or Ecclesiasticus, or Sirach, or whatever you want to call that. And that dates to sometime in the late 200s BC. So in between the testaments, this is still going on. Now, I had you guys, some of this is from last week's stuff and some is, I think, this week's stuff, but a couple of different articles that I wrote. Christmas and the importance of family. And by that, I didn't mean how important it is to travel long distances to be with your parents and siblings and stuff at Christmas, but rather the importance of Jesus' family in that original first Christmas, or the birth of Jesus. In addition, there was another article, and it was called "The One and Only Christmas." And we talked mostly about the Gospel of Luke. And there we talked about the influences of these godly, and I would say beyond it, even, like almost uber pious, traditional observant Jews, Joseph and Mary, who were Jesus' primary sources of instruction in his early years. And I hope that message hit home. You didn't have to agree with every point. That's totally not the point, but that it hit home that there is ancient data on Joseph and on Mary, and that there is a sufficient amount of information, including linguistic information, like Joseph being called a dikaios, a saint or a saintly man, or a Hebrew would be tzaddik, as indicated by inscriptionary evidence from archaeology, as well as from the Septuagint, the Greek Old Testament translation of the Old Testament. And so he is a saintly person, or a tzaddik, hasios in Greek, and that kind of places him in a sort of a special category. Mary as well, where she's going beyond the minimum requirements of the law, and is making an arduous journey to Jerusalem as a woman, not having to go to show up in Jerusalem for festivals, but doing it anyway. That kind of thing. Her attitude about her being a handmaiden of the Lord, obedient from the get-go, whatever it is that God tells her to do or expects of her, that kind of thing. There's an indication that this is not a kind of a Johnny-come-lately Jewish family. This is not a partially Hellenized Jewish family. This is not an uneducated Jewish family, but this is one of those deeply pious communities that the Maccabees actually are known to have resettled Galilee, re-Judaized Galilee with those very kind of people who would resist the temptation to Hellenize and would retain their Jewish identities at all costs. So more from the rabbis. A man should teach his son Torah and a trade. And this is according to stuff all over rabbinic literature. It's just a statement that's repeated over and over again, and as early as the early Tanaim, or the earliest of the rabbis, is indicated by its presence in places like Mishnah texts and Tosefta texts. Also the Tanaitic Midrashim, or the early Midrash, Bible interpretation kind of stuff. So do we have that in the instance of Jesus of Nazareth? We evidently do, because we are told in the New Testament that Joseph was by trade a carpenter. He was a tecton, and that Jesus was also by trade a tecton. It was not because he went to the local community college and learned his carpentry skills or techniques. He learned this by apprenticing with his father, who was also tasked with the responsibility of beginning his studies in both written and oral Torah. In the Babylonian Talmud down at the bottom, a man is obligated to teach a trade to his son. Rabbi Yehuda says, anyone who does not teach his son a trade, it is as if he teaches him robbery. Why would that be? If you can't make a living legally, you're going to do it illegally. If you can't earn money yourself, you're going to steal the money of others. So this is kind of a New Testament reality that we see supported by assertions made in rabbinic texts. Education began with the father. As soon as a child was able to speak, we're going to see this in a text in just a moment. Then he would be taught begin to be taught Bible. His learning started with the Aleph Bet, and started whenever the child could begin to speak clearly, and we'll see that as well. In Tosefta Hagigah, this is a Tanaitic text. It's early rabbis, not later rabbis. A child, if he knows how to speak, his father teaches him the Shema, that's the Deuteronomy 6, etc. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. Teaches him also Torah, and teaches him the Lashon HaKodesh, the holy language, which we all know what that is. And by the way, it's not Aramaic. If he does not, it would have been better had that child not come into the world. In the TY is Talmud Yerushalmi, or that's the Hebrew phrase for Jerusalem Talmud. It says if a child knows how to speak, his father teaches him the language of Torah. That's where we get the rabbinic support for this assertion up at the top. All right. There was a teacher who was employed under the employ of the community, and he had a multitude of responsibilities, including being the janitor and the handyman and stuff around the synagogue. His title in Hebrew is Chazan, and we hear about Chazan in Luke 4, where it says he also participated he was one of the functionaries in the synagogue service when the community would meet for Torah study, prayer, and worship. And by the way, the reason why we meet every Sunday, or once a week at least, as a Christian community, is not because it was commanded either by the Hebrew Bible, which it's not. You're required to make journeys to Jerusalem 3 times a year, not 52. And it's also not required in any New Testament text. We're not to neglect the assembling together of one another, as we're taught in the book of Hebrews, but there is no dictate for a specific time for a weekly meeting. Where do we get that? That is clicked and dragged, like the sermon, like the parable, like baptism, like lots of things. That's clicked and dragged from the Judaisms of Jesus' day over into first century Christianity and passed on through the generations until it gets to us. Now, please, no emails this week on this. I am not complaining against weekly meetings. I love going to church, and I'd prefer to do it more than once a week, okay? Hadn't been able to do that for a while because of COVID, and then you really start wanting to go, right? Kids start even complaining, when are we going to go to church? You know, they never complained before, but now they are. So I'm not complaining of, or I'm not inveighing against weekly meetings of the church. All I'm doing is tracking origins here, just kind of making comments about the almost obvious. So the teacher that is called the Chazan, that teacher, that Chazan, teaches the young people by drawing letters on a board. We hear it described in other texts as being coated with wax, that then you can scratch the letters on and inscribe it, you know, kind of indent the wax, and then later on you can remelt the wax, or you can do whatever you want to do, and you can use the board again. This is all before, you know, paper as we know it. And so we get this from another very early text. It's more or less concurrent with Mishnah and Tosefta. It is Tannaitic, or early rabbis. It's called Avot de Rabbi Natan. And this is from the time of Akiva, which is late first, early second century. Akiva's talking about how he learned how to read, or how reading was normally acquired in the late first, early second century. All right, a child's first reading was done in the book of Vayikra, the book of Leviticus. Our response to that would be, well, that's the one that I know least about, because it's all about sacrificial system and all of that other stuff that's really not relevant to us anymore, because Jesus is the final sacrifice, and all of that has been either done away with or has been fulfilled. And so there's no longer any need for that. I would request that you read the book of Hebrews, because in order to understand the book of Hebrews, you have to understand where they're pulling from, and they're pulling from the Hebrew Bible, and they're talking about the sacrificial system. It is important for us to understand the combination. It's a very interesting thing. What the Gospels and what the book of Hebrews does, they combine the Passover sacrificial lamb with the once for all, or the once for a year sacrifice of the Day of Atonement. In fact, the New Testament even uses that kind of language, atonement, to refer to Jesus' sacrifice. So to understand Jesus' death as not simply a martyr's death, as not just the death of a misunderstood good man, or even a malefactor, one has to appreciate the sacrificial system of the Hebrew Bible. For us to get the point of of Jesus' final sacrifice being completed at 3 p.m. in the afternoon, to understand the reason why the gospel writers would take pains to make that point, is to assume that we understand that the beginning of the sacrifices on the day of the preparation of Passover began at exactly 3 p.m. We know this from Josephus. We know this from the rabbis. You see how I timestamp that. I reference Josephus because he is a first century source. And so now no one can say, well, the rabbis aren't relevant. They're too late. They're untrustworthy, et cetera, et cetera. What we did was we corroborated from one corpus of literature with another corpus of literature. So those kinds of things, you can let them get by you for a whole lifetime, or you can dial into the sources and those things become almost self-evident. So Why the book of Leviticus? Because the book of Leviticus is so repetitious. You get repeated terminology about this sacrifice, and then it comes again with the next sacrifice, or with one particular time of year or time of day, and now it's talking about another time of day or another time of year, and the language continues to repeat. So it becomes for us like see Dick run, see Jane run, see Spot run, see Dick, Jane, and Spot run, you know, and you get learning by repetition. In fact, guys, you may remember this, I think from the first session, that the word Mishnah actually means repetition. It comes from the root shana, which means to repeat. Mishnah, repetition. So Vayikra, that's an interesting way to learn how to read, guys. Then you even have the nickname for the Hebrew book Vayikra, or Leviticus. It's called in Aramaic Sifra, which means, quote, the book. You know, it's like the book of books, sort of like Song of Songs or Song of Solomon. It's the greatest of all songs. So Sifra, the book, means, man, this is the one that everybody gets their start with. So there you go. Here's a reference to some material that you might be interested in following up. Catherine Heiser, from the year 2001. It's not an easy book to get your hand on because of the printer and because of the cost of the book. More than likely, you would have to get this from a theological library. Hopefully, they would even have it. But what it indicates is, and there are other studies that that confirm Heiser's conclusions, like that there was a much higher level of literacy in the land of Israel than pretty much anywhere else in the Roman Empire. And the reason is because they have to be a literate society in order to read their Bible and live in community with each other and with God in a way that would please their maker. So we find, for example, in the world of archaeology, that there are lots and lots of pottery coming out of the retaining walls built by farmers for what's called terraced farming. And it seems that the practice was that workers in the fields in ancient times, all the way back to the 1st century, and how do we know that? Because of the style of the pottery, because of the techniques of firing, because of some of it is written on, and font changes from time to time, and you can date ancient texts as well as stuff on pottery based on how the letters are formed. Anyway, the experts tell us that there is a high level of literacy because even common farm hands, migrant workers, hired hands, are able to read and to write, because the stuff that's written on these wine jars has nothing to do with trying to keep up with how many grapes were picked or how many figs were picked that day or whatever. But it's just, in other words, it's not record keeping. It's identifying this jug as belonging to a certain person. So the person who wrote it had to be literate, and it's assumed that other farm workers would be able to read the stuff and know that, you know, this wasn't just for general consumption. This belonged to somebody in particular, and you need to keep your hands off of it. So considerable degree of literacy in the time of Jesus in the land of Israel among the Jewish community. Children learned how to.
Could I ask 2 questions about that?
Yes, please. Yes, please.
Would you have a rough idea of a percentage for Jewish people, their literacy rate, and would the Gentile populations beat that same percentage?
Gentile populations nowhere in the Roman Empire would be even close. I don't have it right off of the top of my head, but I think that it's in the majority. And as I recall, Heiser provides those numbers. You might also be able to search around on the internet. I'm sorry, William, I don't have the exact numbers, and I'm not going to misquote just to make you think I know what that I've memorized all this stuff. But it's out there, and let me encourage you to go after it. Other questions?
I had a question for you real quick, Dr. Nunnally.
Yes, please.
I was just curious. I've thought about teaching my sons Torah. I want to memorize Torah in large swaths. Is there any reference material for where to go to learn the technique that they might have used, or that your doctor father might have used for memorizing that kind of material in that quantity is what I'm referring to?
Yeah, okay. So I have two suggestions, and I actually made these same suggestions to a group of Hebrew students that I have in a seminary class that's going on right now. And we meet late Wednesday night. A lot of people do church on Wednesday night, so we're meeting late. And a question came up because the midterm is coming up, and I said there are a number of ways to facilitate memory. And for whatever reason, you know, we had this right back in the 1800s in our educational system, and some kind of way, and I think part of it has to do with technology and part of it has to do with changing educational modalities. But we seem to have forgotten that these things are out there. They're super low tech. Although you can do high tech stuff, you can, you know, be reading the Bible on your phone as you're walking down the sidewalk. You can, you know, you do that in Hebrew as well with things like Safaria.org. But basically, the ones that I've been the most successful in using are repetition. We've talked about reciting or repeating. Repetition is huge in language acquisition. It's huge in terms of memory. There's just no real way to memorize big chunks of material without the willingness to repeat. Now, it really cuts against our culture because our culture says repetition is boring, okay? I'm not saying that our culture is right. I think our culture has lots of problems in this area, but boring or whatever, you're either going to repeat stuff that you're trying to tell your brain, you're sending signals to your brain. I keep on going over this stuff because it's important for you to retain it, and your brain finally submits. So learning a language or learning a whole bunch of material, mathematical formulas or Torah or Greek classic works or whatever, repeat. Another thing is, don't forget to use the auditory track. We have come to a point in our Western society that you pray to yourself, you think to yourself, you read to yourself, and you go back over material just mental. It's only a party in your own mind. But the reality of it is, if you go to the land of Israel, and this is especially true in Palestinian communities, go in the evenings and you'll see kids that are, you know, like high school age, and they're walking up and down the street and they have a notebook in their hand and they're reading or whatever, they're repeating to themselves. They are learning by repetition. It's an age-old practice, and it's still in evidence in cultures not our own. So you gotta go over it over and over and over it. Akiva says, do it every day. We should be moving back in the direction of orality, and that is being willing to say the stuff out loud. So our mouth gets into the game. All of our, you know, our larynx and our lungs and everything, we're having to generate words, and our ears are hearing what we are saying at the same time we're saying it. And so also writing things down, or even if you want, typing the stuff. I've found it's an amazing way of memorizing lots of scripture if you write it down, or if you type it into, even if you're going to delete it at the end. There's something about getting your body involved in this practice rather than being so cotton picking cerebral, the way that we have had it role modeled for us in Western formal education. So notice that even Randall, even in this little quote right here, reading and recitation as including prayer All of that was done out loud in the 1st century, and it's still going on in certain cultures today. I hope that that's helpful. But there are several suggestions in there: repetition, orality, and writing, and getting all your faculties involved in that. Peyton, did you have something you wanted to jump in on?
Yeah, I did. I think I must not have been unmuted. So some of these rabbis were talking about educating your children. That include girls and boys, because I feel like I thought that boys went to Torah class at a certain age, which is where I assumed that actually learning to read and write would be taught. But a lot of these things, like reciting the Shema, sounds like something that would be done from a very young age, where it would be both boys and girls at home. So where did that split off in terms of male and female education?
The evidence is mixed in terms of gender involvement in the 1st century. First of all, there's not a whole lot of evidence. The second thing is that we do hear about women who are very much engaged in Torah study, Torah interpretation, not just memorizing Torah, but actually interpreting, and even being consulted from time to time about what's the proper interpretation and application of this rule. How do we live out our Judaism in this area? Well, the males in the area are conflicted about it, and so they will sometimes go and ask females, what do we do on this? And when they hear, then they say, and the halakha, or the way of living, your life as an observant Jew, is established in this way. In other words, they follow what the women say. It's not entirely unique. We hear about this somewhere around 2 Kings 22, where the godly King Josiah sent some of his courtesans down to the house of the prophetess Huldah, who lived in the, quote, 2nd quarter. We know exactly where that is in Jerusalem, and asked her, what do we do about this? And the prophetess Huldah told these advisors or whatever of godly King Josiah, here's what you do, here's what you tell him. And they went back and told him, and they did it. So does that happen on every page of the Hebrew Bible? No. Does it happen all the time in rabbinic literature? No. It's the it's a gross minority of times that that's happening. But the point is that there are those exceptions. So methodologically, for me, it's always a matter of an issue, a question. How many exceptions do you find until there really is no rule? You know? So I'll let you play around with that. But there are examples of females who are very learned in the Torah, both oral and written Torah, and who are sometimes even consulted in terms of matters of interpretation and application of Torah law.
Fascinating.
It is fascinating. It's mind-blowing, the stuff that's actually out there. Really amazing what's even out there. All right, thank you guys. Jump in when you need to. So you have prayer that is done aloud. We're going to get to that further in our study tonight, having to do with the prayer practices of Jesus. Regular recitation of scripture and prayer, such as Shema and V'hayim Shemoah as part of the Shema, served as aids to the memory. You just go over it, you know. All have sinned and come short of the glory of God. Wages of sin is death, but the gift of God is eternal life. For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten son. The more that you recite it, the better you know it. And it's just now a matter of, you know, some Bible passages by heart. Now it's just a matter of increasing your repertoire. Kind of like a band increases the songs that they're able to play. It's by practice, focus, repetition, and all these other modalities. So the goal is to train the memory. Memory was, at least in many communities, and for most people, it's even more important than the ability to read. Here's our text from Chagigah. The advantage of repetition is unlimited. To review 100 times is better than to repeat 100. 101 times is better than to repeat 100 times. And that's early rabbinic literature too. All right, you have this, the story about in rabbinic literature, and it's down at the bottom. This guy named Yehoshua ben Gamla set up schools, or decreed that there had to be a public school everywhere that there is a significant Jewish population. And but this was in reality already in existence in Jesus' day, because it was something that Shimon ben Shetach had done in the 1st century BC. So that was a reality that Jesus was born into, that there were schools that were publicly supported and were then therefore available to everybody regardless of their socioeconomic status. We're told in the Mishnah, in, let's see, it's in I think it's Avot chapter 6, that you start this process around age 6. That's the formal process. Remember, though, that age 3, or whenever the kid is able to talk fluently, they're already being taught Torah and being taught, how to read and stuff at home. So by age 6, they're primed and ready, and they're taken to a school that is built onto the local synagogue, typically. We'll see pictures of that in just a moment. The ideal student was compared to, and this is a beautiful passage, Eliezer ben Horkanus, who is a plastered cistern that doesn't lose a drop. Nothing leaks out, in other words. Interesting. You remember the story, or the figure that is given by the prophet Jeremiah? I believe it's chapter 2. My people have committed 2 evils. They have forsaken the fountain of living waters. And by the way, Jesus plays off on that at the end of John chapter 7. But if anyone comes to me, let him thirst. Living water flowing out of his innermost being. All right. So, and then the second thing is that they've hewn for themselves cisterns, cracked cisterns that can hold no water. Well, this is a maintained cistern, plastered cistern that doesn't lose a drop. Who is Eliezer ben Horkanus? He's one of the 5 major students of a guy named Yochanan ben Zakkai. Yochanan ben Zakkai was the greatest rabbinic figure that was in the city of Jerusalem when it fell in AD 70. So Eliezer ben Horkanus is a 1st century rabbi. Does everybody get that? He was trained by Yochanan ben Zakkai, and Yochanan ben Zakkai was also himself a 1st century personage who was personally present during the siege of Jerusalem in AD 70. All right, now, there again is just an example of how you can stratify rabbinic texts using certain methods. One who has forgotten one word of his learning is like one who has forfeited his life. That's Tractate Avot in the Mishnah. Greater is learning in the Torah than in priesthood or kingship. He who occupies, you can be a high priest, you can be the monarch, and you're not greater than one who has been able to learn Torah. He who occupies himself in this study, and one who retells exactly what he's heard and reports a thing in the name of him who said it, he brings deliverance into the world. I made mention of that a little bit earlier. Use the same words as your teacher. Guys, this is like super important. This is not something like, oh, well, that's of antiquarian interest. Hopefully I'll forget about that so I have more room in my brain for other stuff like, things I've got going on at work. No, this is really important. Why? Because if the Christian movement, if Jesus had not been born into a Palestinian 1st century Jewish matrix, if early Christianity hadn't been birthed within that same matrix, if Jesus' disciples had been, paganized or Hellenized Jews, or had not been brought up like this, then we might have to admit with those from the kind of the middle right already to the far extreme left, that, well, it is possible that the stuff that's in the New Testament, Jesus didn't really say that, or he might have said some version of it, but it got perverted, it got forgotten, it got added to, things got changed and editorialized and that sort of thing, as because there was such a long period of time between the events of Jesus' life and when the Gospels were written down. What we are learning about rabbinic Judaism, and we're learning it from the sources, it's not speculation, we have ancient texts that give us this stuff in black and white, is you had to be able to memorize, and you had to be able to remember. You had to be able to transmit accurately, not just the gist of what was said, but even the technical terms that are no longer in use. And you had to be able to tell where you got that stuff from, who said that. This is telling us something important about our Gospels. Our Gospels come from the kind of people that grew up with this incredible emphasis on memory that we don't have in our world today. We have no analogy with this except for people who are 1 in a million, who have just the weird ability to memorize exact dates. You've seen them on the morning shows and stuff like that, right? But this was common in the first century. It was common in the 20th century. I asked my doctor father one time, I said, Dr. Vacho, and I remember this conversation was going on in the late 80s or early 90s. So forgive my non-politically correct terminology. I said to Dr. Wacholder one day, I said, Dr. Wacholder, when you were growing up in Poland and you were learning all of this material, volumes of material in your local synagogue, were you looked at as being kind of like a Bible nerd, kind of like exceptional, and everybody else is out playing, soccer or whatever, but no, you're in there hammering away at Talmud and at Torah. And he said, oh no, he said, every little kid in my village learned like this. And if you couldn't, then you were viewed by all of the rest of the villagers as being mentally retarded. I went, okay, then write my name down right beside any of the other ones, because that's definitely not my world. Anyway, I offer you that as kind of almost like oral Torah from the 20th century. This is what I was told to my face by someone who had participated in this same kind of similar kind of culture. All right. We talked a little bit about this, but it's not just about Jesus, and it's not just about the disciples, the apostles who produced gospel text. This is also, you need to be aware of this incredible biblical literacy and incredible capacity for memory so that you can understand things that are going on in Jesus' teaching. For example, when he says to, and I've written on this, when he says to the woman caught in adultery, isn't it amazing that we adopt the terminology of the very people who brought her before Jesus? She wasn't evidently caught in adultery because no one could produce a viable witness to corroborate that charge or to substantiate that charge. Anyway, we oftentimes find ourselves with strange bedfellows, and we do in that text as well. But the point there is that Jesus says, let him who is without sin among you be the first to cast a stone, cast the stone. And when he says be the first to, you just have to always be reading Jesus with this in mind. Is he hypertexting? Is he giving me a piece, sometimes just one word of a Hebrew Bible text that he expects me then to channel into that discussion and understand his words in light of that? What is he channeling there? What text is he hypertexting? In the book of Deuteronomy, it says that, and the witnesses shall be the first to put their hand against the accused to put them to death. Absolutely fascinating. So what he did was, he said, let him who is without sin among you be the first to. And so what he's doing is, in that highly literate biblical world, he's saying, All right, you've just appealed to the law of Moses. The law of Moses said we should stone such. Okay, let's do it by the law of Moses. Let's sit down and let's do it by the entire Torah, including I want to see witnesses. I want 2 or more people to step up that I can then separate and I can depose separately. And guess what? Also at the end of the book of Deuteronomy, it says that if the witnesses are found to be aid shaker, a false witness, then they are to suffer the same penalty that they were trying to have imposed on the accused. In other words, Jesus has completely flipped the script in John 8, and now the people that are on the bubble are the people who are making the claim, we caught her in adultery. Okay, step up and testify to that, and let me cross-examine you independently and then compare your testimony. And guess what? If you are found lying, then it's not she who will be stoned here today. It will be you. Absolutely amazing stuff begins to pop out of the text when you realize that Jesus is dealing with an audience that is so highly literate. All he has to do is say a word or a short phrase of a text, and everybody's mind runs there. They know the rest. They can fill in all of the rest of the blanks themselves. We are going to have to, if we want to understand everything that Jesus says, and I do, I'm not saying that I ever will, I'm just saying I want to. If we're going to understand everything that Jesus says, then we're going to have to start moving in that same direction. Yeah, I'm just saying, we can stay in our Sunday school mentality if we want to, but I've chosen to not want to, and you have to make your own decision. Let's take a look at a first century synagogue. Here we're looking at a satellite image that shows the kind of northeastern end of the Nazareth Ridge. That's because Nazareth is down here in this yellow box, yellow and white box. Okay, so if Jesus is going to go from Nazareth to Capernaum, he probably goes down here, joins a road near the modern road, which I'm moving along now, goes past right here, the horns of Hattin. Some of you have been to Israel, so you know what I'm talking about. And then continues to move in a northeasterly direction until he goes through the Arbel Pass, that's the shadow there, and onto the plain of Gennesaret. When he's moving from Nazareth, here in the lower left, all the way over to Capernaum on the north shore of the Sea of Galilee, when he gets to the plain of Gennesaret, he is really within a stone's throw of this little yellow box, and that's Migdal or Magdala, the home of Mary Magdalene. And here's that cut in the earth's crust in a mountain ridge that has been eroded away, that then dumps out onto the plain of Gennesaret right here. This is the western and northern shore of the Sea of Galilee. And over behind this, if we had X-ray vision, Superman vision, we could see through this. You can see Magdala along the coastline, down about right here. Here's a picture of that. We're on the plain of Gennesaret here in the foreground. And right when you get to this curve in the road, there is an excavation. It took place totally by accident when the earth was being cleared for the construction of that Mexican Catholic retreat center that's there now in 2009. The excavators, the earth moving machinery, hit worked rock. So archaeologists were called in and excavation ensued, and in which one of the very few first century synagogues in the land of Israel were discovered. We know this is first century because the coins found in between the rocks and laid in the floor as a sort of a kind of a dedicatory offering. When the floor was removed, coins were found from the time of Archelaus, the son of Herod the Great. And so back at the time of Jesus' early childhood. So this is a first century synagogue, and it joins one of, I think, only 7, maybe 8 now, possibly. There's still work being done on that. First century synagogues in the land of Israel. My friend Marv has got his foot on the original threshold stone there, and he's a good-looking young man, isn't he? Gospel of Mark says he went into their synagogues throughout all of Galilee. This means that some kind of way Jesus made his way to synagogues all over Galilee. That would include Migdal or Magdala, because Magdala is in Galilee. In fact, it's on the Sea of Galilee, preaching and casting out the demons. So my assumption based on this text and this first century synagogue is that Jesus was there. So here's, as the excavation kind of unfolded, here's an interesting reality. You get seats around the edge of the outer wall. And that's common for first century, even for fifth century synagogues for that matter. That's common synagogue architecture. You say, yeah, no, but that doesn't look like a church. Yes, I know the basilica style thing with the rows of pews didn't come in until Byzantine Christianity. So this is what's going on. People gather together and they're all looking at each other, not at one another, the back of one another's heads. In that respect, it's a lot more participatory and democratic than most of the stuff that we have going on in our churches today. What's interesting about this synagogue, though, is it not only has these outer rows, you see the benches, right? Is that you have an inner set of benches right here, and then another inner set of benches inside the inner set of benches. So you have kind of like box seats in this synagogue. It's a small structure, but Magdala was a relatively large fishing village, known for its pickling of fish. And so this is the only example that I know of where there were permanently installed chief seats of the synagogue. You remember that Jesus says the kind of hypocritical religious leaders love the place of honor at banquets and the chief seats in the synagogue. Notice place of honor and chief seats are in poetically parallel position in the same way that banquets and synagogues is. This is Hebrew poetic parallelism in terms of its literary form or device. And so chief seats of the synagogue, we now, in my estimation, by the way, I've never read this in any of the technical literature. I've never heard anybody say this on site or in the land of Israel, but this is my identification. This has got to be an example of chief seats in the synagogue. Why? Because of this stone right here. That stone, by the way, notice the chariot wheel there. It's associated with the glory of God, which was associated with the temple in Jerusalem. This stone is pointing toward the south. It's pointing this direction. It's pointing to the south because that's where the temple is. And when you get to this this rock, you see it's different from these rocks. These rocks are black rock. This is imported limestone, probably from the area around Jerusalem, maybe even from Jerusalem itself. And up close, you see that it's covered in symbols representing the temple. For example, the two great pillars of Solomon's temple, Yachin and Boaz, the two silver flagons used for the drink or the pour offerings, the menorah, that there's only one of them in the first century, and it's in the Holy of Holies. There's this rosette or another chariot wheel here, representing again the Shekinah or the glory of God, the dwelling presence of God, as mentioned in Ezekiel 1 and Ezekiel 11. You see the lamp, the oil lamp right here that represents the light that the temple is to the world, according to the rabbis. Notice on the four corners, you get, just like the altar of sacrifice, you have four horns of the altar, possibly used in a very functional way to keep Torah scrolls on the platform. You see these little stubs. There were evidently either wooden or stone legs that went down to the floor. So this was jacked up off of the floor and was, I think, the top of a pulpit. If so, then, and Jesus preached and taught in this synagogue, this likely served as the table that Jesus would use, like in Luke 4, where he would unroll the scroll of Isaiah and read from Isaiah the prophet, "The Spirit of the Lord God is upon me, and he has anointed me to preach the gospel to the poor," etc. Here's a picture of the same synagogue. There's what we were looking at, the Magdala stone there. Here are some columns that were covered with plaster. Here's the inner circle, or the two inner circles of the chief seats of the synagogue. Now, on this, in this area here, there is a little schoolhouse. This is the Beit Midrash, or the place of learning Bible and oral Torah. You can see right there that the very stools or benches for Torah study are still in place. This has not been reconstructed. This is exactly as the archaeologists found it. And then right here, you find another stone that's somewhat analogous. It's not nearly as ornate as this one, but this is a stone that the Torah would be unrolled on and where it would be read from. How do we know that? Look at this trench here and the trench there. When you unroll the two sides of the Torah scroll, the rolls on either side would rest in these trenches, and the scroll would not have to be held in order to keep one's place, to keep it open to the passage that is being read and studied. This is the kind of place, this is a first century schoolhouse connected to a synagogue. This is exactly what we would have had in the city of Nazareth where Jesus grew up. The synagogue hasn't been found because Nazareth is not very much excavated. But if there ever is a more extensive excavation, it's likely that an edifice like this is going to come up out of the ground at Nazareth if it wasn't completely destroyed because of the ravages of time.
Professor,
Yes.
that's a facsimile there in the archaeological dig. The original Magdala stone is in the Israeli Antiquities Authority, correct?
I think that it is on display at Notre Dame in Jerusalem. This is
wow.
This is a facsimile. In fact, where I'm standing, taking this picture, over behind me is another facsimile, so that people can gather around it, take pictures, and discussion can go on between groups and teachers there. So
fun story. I'm a docent and living history interpreter. I was a living history interpreter at the new Museum of the Bible in Washington, D.C., where a third facsimile of that stone was reproduced and put in a recreation of the village of Nazareth in the third floor, the narrative floor of the Museum of the Bible. The Israeli Antiquities Authority came through at opening day in November 2017 and found that the museum had reconstructed the table on top of the stone, and they asked us to remove it. So before the opening day, we had to remove that facsimile stone from the recreation synagogue because it was unverified what the wooden top may or may not have looked like. Could it have been a Torah scroll table?
Yeah, I gotcha. I understand. And so just as a point of curiosity, I don't believe that stone in the synagogue is the base. I believe it's the head, it's the top. And here's why: because it's beveled. You can see it in its in situ situation. By the way, those earlier pictures, not the last one that I showed, not this one, but this is in situ. This is not a reconstruction. That's it in its original location, and that is the original stone. You can see it here as well. This isn't even open. You can see the raw dirt right here. This isn't open for visitors yet. And so the only people who have access to this at the point that this picture was taken was the excavators themselves. This is the original stone, not a facsimile. I will say though that those facsimile versions, they would fake me out, as an untrained person. This would get me. The original, the facsimiles would fake me out totally. However, my point is that this is beveled, and it's beveled in the direction that the person would stand here and would be facing Jerusalem as they read, as they said blessings both before and after the reading as required in rabbinic law. And since it's unlevel, it doesn't make any sense to start. Any builder will tell you if you start with an unlevel foundation, then anything you build on top of that is unsteady. So based on that, also based on the fact that if you have representations of the temple of God in Jerusalem, it's not going to be a footstone, it's going to be a headstone. It just doesn't make any sense. We would also, unless it was wooden, we would need the head. Where is the head? I think that this is the head. And I believe that either there was wooden legs underneath it, or possibly stone legs that were removed, as Josephus describes in his History of the Jewish War, to construct a hastily made defensive wall for the part of Magdala where the Magdalaites were going to make their stand against the Romans in AD 67, I believe. So that's just for what it's worth there.
Thank you very much.
Yep, you bet. Oh, do you know Joanne Goretzky?
Sounds familiar, but I'm not too sure.
She's an older lady that has been a student of mine and is also a docent there at Museum of the Bible.
Well, it's a great place. I highly encourage people to visit. The Israeli Antiquities Authority has a permanent gallery there on the 5th floor, 10-year exhibit of their materials, and they rarely lend them out.
Wow, that's really neat. Neat place. Here's a text that I just wanted to get back to. Goodness, we're just so running out of time. My apologies. That I wanted to bring to your attention. We are told by the Jerusalem Talmud and lots of other places that there were 480 synagogues in Jerusalem at the time that it was destroyed by Vespasian. And so there's a historical reference. This goes back to AD 70. It was really not Vespasian that destroyed it. It was his son Titus. But Vespasian was the emperor. Anyway, it says of in this text that in the synagogues, there were all of them had a Beit Sefer, that's for studying the Bible, and a Beit Talmud, that was the place where it's the same as a Beit Midrash, a place where you study Torah and oral Torah and written Torah. And, there you have it. There's also an inscription. It's called the Theodotus inscription from the 1st century. It's on display in the Israel Museum, and it talks about the educational function of early synagogues. I should have that, but I don't have it here. Just look up the Theodotus inscription on Wikipedia, and it'll give you the text of it. When Jesus talks about the jot and the tittle, in Hebrew, it's the yod and the kots, the smallest Hebrew letter, and then the little protrusions that differentiate one letter from another. Like, for example, the foot on the lower left of the tav that differentiates it from the chet, etc. Then Jesus was clearly referring to and was knowledgeable of, aware of the newer square borrowed from Aramaic script, and not the ancient kind of script like you find in the Siloam inscription and other stuff that you get from the First Temple period. Jesus was able to write. We know that he wrote on the ground. So he is right. He's not doodling. He's not writing numbers. He's writing letters. What it was, you've heard all kinds of stuff. I've written an article on it. You're welcome to take a look at that if you're interested in my opinion. You are probably blessed among men and among women if you're not interested in my opinion. The point is this, that we have heard for so long. Here's an example from John Dominic Crossan of the Jesus Seminar, Jesus, the Life of a Mediterranean Jewish Peasant. In this, as well as the works by John Mayer and others, that Jesus was an uneducated, illiterate, hand-to-mouth living peasant in Galilee. That's a really problematic historical reconstruction. What's the reason? Why is it problematic? Because of the evidence to the contrary. Okay, we're going to skip the stuff on Paul, and then I want to start use our what time we have remaining, and we can always go into next time too, on movements in Galilee in the days of Jesus that would have been kind of formative in terms of what kind of piety we could expect to see in Jesus as growing up in those in that area. So you may have heard of the Hasidim. You know, these guys wear the black hats and the big furry hats and stuff like that, the long black robes and that kind of thing, like you see in Philadelphia or New York or Chicago or Jerusalem and the like. And the problem is that, yes, it is the same word, but these are not the same people. That Hasidic movement got started in the 17th century, 1700s, with a guy named Baal Shem Tov, who was in Eastern Europe. So that's a more modern movement. I'm talking about a group of people that the name was, I guess, borrowed from, that go back to the days, at least to the days of the Maccabees. And we know this because of the presence of that term in ancient texts that go back to those times. So we read about in the Mishnah and Tractate Avot, Simon the Righteous, and you see his dates there, was one of the men of the great assembly or the great synagogue. He used to say, the world stands or is sustained by three things: by the Torah, by study of Torah, by the temple service, that is the sacrificial system, and by Gemilut Chasadim. In other words, the good deeds of these ultra pious people. Now, take note of his date. I know the Mishnah comes from a later time, but they're quoting an earlier rabbinic authority who goes back to the 2nd, 3rd century BC. And so Gemilut Chasadim, the deeds of the ultra pious. First Maccabees is the next reference that we get, and that comes from around the year 134, 132 BC. And it says, there were united with them a company of Hasidim, mighty warriors in Israel, everyone who offered himself willingly for the Torah, to defend the Torah from the Greek rulers who were trying to impose Hellenism on the Jewish people and get rid of Sabbath observance, circumcision, and Torah reading and study. The Greeks knew if they could get rid of these three pillars, that it would basically be the end of Judaism as it was known in that day. There's also a group of people called the Anshe Ma'aseh, or the men of deed, men of some like great act of valor or something like that. Seems to be roughly synonymous. Why? Because of just the way that the stuff is used. You can tell what is a synonym or an antonym or is amplificatory or something like that when you're reading literature. And it looks like that this Anshe Ma'aseh is the same as the Hasidim. These are guys who performed good deeds, like the Hasidim, toward those who were in need, including the working of miracles, and would, as the pious of the community, would dance with torches and sing praises in the temple and stuff in situations like at the Feast of Sukkot or tabernacles or booths. Some of the examples of these guys, you may have heard these names: Honi Ma'agil or Me'agel, who prayed for rain, who drew the circle around and said, God, I'm not leaving the circle until you send rain. He is a 1st century BC person. He is also referred to in Josephus. And so we have a way of triangulating his date, as well as the reality that there was this, really important. And what is going on in that passage in Josephus? He is approached by some people in the 1st century, and he is asked to pray for rain. And it's pretty much comports pretty well with what we have in rabbinic literature. His grandsons also, Abba Chilkiyahu and Hanan Anechba, these guys are mentioned also as miracle working rabbis in the late first century BC and the early first century AD. Hanina ben Dosa, another miracle working rabbi. All of these guys, by the way, from Galilee. All of them from Galilee. Hanina ben Dosa is also referenced as being a worker of miracles. He is able to produce physical healing. He is protected miraculously from the bite of a poisonous adder, and the snake dies instead of Ben Dosa dying. He's miracles of multiplication and all kinds of interesting things are associated with these guys in this Hasidic Galilean rabbinic Pharisaic movement. You have other guys, Shimon ben Yochai and others that have come right after the time of Jesus. So there is this strain of Galilean Hasidism that is engaged in miracle working, and also another component of their spirituality, which is if the Torah or if the halakha, the current Jewish application, requires something, they're going to go a step further. They're going to be even more observant than is expected or required by any authoritative source, written or oral. This Hasidism survived into the 1st century BC and into the 1st century AD. Hillel is described as a Hasid, and he talks about Hasidism. Hillel, that the co-leader of the Sanhedrin and founder of one of the great houses of rabbinic learning, who was flourishing at the end of the 1st century, beginning of the end of the 1st century BC, beginning of the 1st century AD. Abstinence. This is huge. When the abstinent ones increased in Israel, we hear about this in early rabbinic literature. Who are the abstinent ones? These are the mihadrin, the ones who keep a higher level of kosher, or keep the feasts, or keep ritual purity, or keep Shabbat, or something like that, even more than is expected in the Bible or in current culture. And you see this in people like the Essenes, who are living a very austere lifestyle. You see it in John the Baptist. You also see it in Jesus. Jesus does not marry. Jesus has no place to lay his head. Jesus is sustained by collections that are taken up from people of means, and that sort of thing. So we see Jesus, we see John the Baptist, and then there are other people who are mentioned in the literatures outside the Bible, the Dead Sea Scrolls, Josephus' description of the Essenes, John the Baptist, and others. So there's this strain that's kind of a subset of these Hasidim or Anshe Ma'aseh, or however you want to call them. Here's an example from rabbinic literature. I was having a conversation with a Jewish guide at Kfar Kedem in Galilee. And he said, you know what I don't understand about you guys is that all of the most important people at the beginning of Christianity, they didn't get married. Now even popes and stuff, bishops and priests, they don't get married. And so I said, well, who are you referring to? He said, well, like John the Baptist, he wasn't married. Jesus wasn't married. Paul wasn't married. And that's just so not Jewish, is his complaint. You've been talking about how Jewish early Christianity is, including its founders. And he says this thing that is kind of like one of the most important things. The Bible says, be fruitful, multiply, and fill the earth. That was a requirement of Adam and Eve. It's a requirement of us today. I just don't understand how you could be making this claim that Jesus, John the Baptist, Paul, and all they're closely tied in with the Judaism of their day. And I said, okay, well, you're saying that these guys are unique? He said, yeah, that's what I'm saying, is that these guys are not, they're totally out of step with anything we know about ancient Judaism. I said, what about the Essenes? He said, what about the Essenes? I said, well, Josephus says that most of them didn't marry. I said, how about these guys who are called the Therapeutae by Philo, when he writes about this Jewish movement in Egypt? They didn't get married either. What about people that are in the rabbinic movement in the land of Israel that weren't getting married? He goes, oh, there weren't any of those. No, that's definitely, no homeboys are involved in this. And I said, do you have your telephone? I think I'd left mine on the bus. He said, yeah, I have my telephone. Because we use this all the time in Israel, this Safaria. I said, dial up Safaria and check out what the Bavli says about Shimon ben Azai. And he says, okay. And then he stands there. We haven't even moved. We're just standing there at Kfar Kedem. And he says, I never saw this in the Talmud before. I said, read it to me. So he reads to me in Hebrew, my soul is in love with Torah. The world can be perpetuated or continued or increased by others. There you have it. And in that text, the rabbis are complaining to Shimon ben Azai that he has taught it's important to be fruitful in the Peru Revu, be fruitful and multiply, but he's not practicing it. And so that was actually the passage that I was reading when I got in trouble with my wife earlier this week. My soul is in love with Torah. The world can be perpetuated by others. Here's another one of the Hasidim. Phineas, Pinchas bin Yair, that's Jairus in Hebrew, said that the pursuit of personal holiness, Hasidut, leads to the attainment of the Holy Spirit. So the age of the Spirit, think Jesus, think early church, think day of Pentecost, according to the rabbis, is to be pursued by folks who are willing to go the extra mile, to go to the extra level of holiness and purity. All right, well, I think that we have Tzaddik, that takes us right into the world of Joseph, the dikaios, the righteous person, but the man Joseph being a dikaios, or a holy one. You've seen a whole lot about the origins of Jesus' educational background, about some of the early movements that were swirling around him in the Galilee of his day. And now, instead of seeing Jesus in a bubble, hopefully you're seeing a Jesus that is fitting quite well into his world. One of my goals, guys, is this: that we begin to see Jesus not as weird, as bizarre, as marching to the beat of a different drummer all the time, of never being understood when he spoke by anybody, because he was always speaking over their head, speaking past them, but as a Jesus who is fully engaged in his culture, a Jesus who is fully in touch with that culture and able to tap into it in order to communicate with his audience, and a Jesus who does not go around offending people for no reason in his culture. If there's an issue, he doesn't mind picking at that. He doesn't mind dialoguing, debating, but he does not simply go around swashbuckling, scorched earth policy on everything. He's not a rebel. He's not a renegade. He is a reformer. And as such, he is expecting people to understand when he speaks. And people are understanding. Now, when the Pharisees perceived that Jesus was talking about them, even people whose hearts were hardened were understanding what Jesus was saying. So I'm hoping that we are beginning to get to a point where we're tapping into sources and we're realizing Jesus did not have antennas. Jesus was not from Mars. Jesus was not weird or somebody that people ran away from. He was people were attracted to him. If he's our ultimate role model, guys, just by way of application, this needs to be our situation as well. We can't be prickly porcupines. We can't be againers. We can't be against everything in our world and expect to have our voice respected, received, heard. So we pick our battles carefully. We choose those issues that are the most important, and we're constantly looking for opportunities to build bridges to connect with our world without compromising the things that are important, our most basic principles. Jesus was able to find a way forward. There's a reason why his life is the most important life ever lived. There's a reason why this Jesus that we're spending all this time studying, that time is marked by his life, before his life and after his life. Jesus found a way. So he is connected to, associated with, respected by people like Nicodemus and Joseph of Arimathea and rabbis that would come to him, Pharisees that would say, you need to get out of here. Herod wants to kill you. They were concerned for his personal safety. He made an impact in his culture. By the time of Acts chapter 5, if the numbers are correct, based on the archaeology of Jerusalem, the majority of Jerusalem had come to faith in Jesus. All the authorities were scared to death that this new movement was going to remove them from their place of authority, and that Judaism, as they understood it, was going to be undermined. Huge splash in his day, in his world. He's called on us to do the same. He's called on us to do the same. The first century church changed their world, turned it upside down, according to Acts 17. I think it's really high time that the church of the 21st century start thinking in those terms as well. He did it. They did it. With God's help, we can too, but not by alienating ourselves and shooting at every flag that gets run up the flagpole. All right, our time is over, and you've survived me another night. So we're gonna keep going. We're gonna keep pushing through this stuff. Next week we'll be continuing. We'll be moving in the direction of the syllabus. We will finish, and we will get caught up. But this stuff is just too good to. This interaction with these ancient sources is too good to just give a short shrift to, or just completely leave behind, just to keep up with some arbitrary set of dates and assignments that I gave when I didn't really know how this class was going to unfold. So hang with me, will you? And I trust that God's going to bless you. He's going to meet you in this and move the ball forward in your life. Have a great evening.